Before we even start this video, I just want to let you all know why there wasn't any video uploaded yesterday and why there's two today. I have been extremely busy and wasn't able to edit these videos until now, so I'm very sorry for it, but I will let you all know that from now on this entire upcoming week, I'm going to be able to make so many new videos, and then there would be no chance of me not uploading for a while. Another thing before we get into this one, there was supposed to be a live stream today, but as I said, I am on a very tight schedule today, so it will have to be delayed for tomorrow, Monday, April 9th at 6 o'clock Eastern Time. That's about it, let's get right into the video. Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're gonna be reviewing Renaissance by Renaissance.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So as you might inferred from the intro to this video, this is Renaissance by Renaissance, their debut album, the first album by a band that would go on to create such amazing albums, such amazing songs, be so memorable in the hearts of many. But before all that, here are some of my favorite bits from this album. This album was one I was waiting so long, so patiently to listen to. As you might know from things I've said in the past videos or over on my Patreon, you might know that back in 2021 I realized that I was not discovering enough music, thus I decided to start this series. But the music I did discover back in 2021 was the music of Renaissance. I discovered albums like Scheherazade and Song for All Seasons, and I even got to know Ashes Are Burning better. And completely falling in love with Renaissance last year, I decided to put a lot of their albums on this list, and thus we resulted with a lot of episodes revolving around this band. Now, I've anticipated a lot of their albums, but this one in particular because this is their debut and I want to get to know what they sounded at the start of their career. Now, you might recall that I said in my previous Renaissance video about their second album, Illusion, that the Renaissance incarnation of the first two albums is quite different, actually a whole lot different from the incarnation they would be better known as in the later years. And although I gave a quick summary about that in the last video, I'm gonna say it quickly again. So there was a band called the Yardbirds which disbanded and split into two bands, one being Led Zeppelin, the other one being Renaissance. Mainly led by the Relf siblings, this new band was going for a much more proggier side because prog was starting to get popular at the time, as this one came out in 1969. And this album in particular today was a bag full of mystery for me. I had no idea what I was expecting from it, and honestly I was awaiting listening to this one very patiently because I wanted to get to know if this album was good or not, and let me assure you, I was definitely surprised to the better side. So this album starts off like any debut album with what is arguably the most essential, most important song of any band's careers, and that's the first track on their first album, and in this case this one is called Kings and Queens. A lovely track, a really great track track. Personally, I think it's a perfect track. It's my favorite from this album. It features that proggy sound, very proto-progish, but still getting into the spirit of things, and in addition it has a lot of influences from Renaissance era music. And if I were browsing a record shop back in the day and I saw a band called Renaissance with an album called Renaissance, I would expect something Renaissance-like in the music, and this song definitely delivers just that. And I think what surprised me the most about this song in particular and the entire album as a whole is the wonderful musicianship. You can see that these guys played together in the past, they knew what they were doing, they weren't trying to travel new grounds, they were of course experimenting, but still they came up with something really good. And I think the thing that was basically the best about this album, an eargasm of sound, was the piano playing. It was just marvelous on this song, and the rest of the album is no less than that. And you know, I was pretty surprised because for some reason this specific song and some of this album really sounds like it's some B-sides or outtakes from an album like Scheherazade, which is arguably their best album to date. Another signature instrument from Renaissance that really caught my attention was the bass. Very original, very innovative, very thick and very noticeable, which is something I always like when an album does. It is very non-characteristic for a year like 1969. Like, this entire album as a whole is very progressive in its nature, and it's really surprising to me because I did not expect this from a 1969 band. This is something you'd expect to see later in the early 70s and definitely going on forwards. Unfortunately, on this first track we still don't get to hear any of the vocals by Jane Ralph, which I absolutely liked in the second album, but it's no worries because they appear later on in this album. Now, after such a great opener, a perfect song in my opinion to open up with, I was expecting to be disappointed by the second one called Innocence, but alas, I was surprised yet again. That song is way more experimental in the sound. It stretches things out, not to the point of annoyment, but to the point of very much exploring new grounds and trying new things, which I really personally liked. Again, we don't get any of the Jane Ralph action, but we do have the lovely vocals by the other band members. And then we are introduced to the third track on this album called Island. Now, this is where we get firstly the vocals by Jane Ralph. I was really waiting for it because, as you might know, Renaissance and female vocals is basically bread and butter. They just go together so well, and I was actually kind of surprised because the vocals by Jane are not as good as I remember them on the second album, Illusion. And needless to say, of course, they're not as good as Annie Houslum's, but still, they were actually pretty nice. I think this track in particular, I loved it to bits, and it is really akin to a track like Sweetness from Yes's debut album, so if you really happen to like Yes's debut album, I will assure you that you'd really love listening to this one as well. Then we get another good track, but what is arguably an unnecessary one in the context of this album. It's called Wanderer. I don't really like it all that much. I think it's pretty good, but I wasn't excited about it as all like the rest of this album. And lastly, we finish off with a track called Bullet. Now, this track really surprised me because it has a runtime of 11.5 minutes, but at the 3.5 minutes the vocals were over, there was no singing left to do, and I realized that we are about to experience 8 minutes of pure instrumentals. And as you might know, this is the last track of the album. This arguably is the most important one because this is the one that leaves a taste in your mouth, and 8 minutes of instrumentals on your debut is quite a lot to ask, and I was hoping for them to be good, and I was actually pretty surprised because they were quite fine. And you know what? Fine isn't really a good definition for it. It's great. It really is quite great. I think the highlight of this instrumental section has to be the guitar solo by Keith Relf. And this is no electric guitar winding its way through an epic solo in the middle of this song. No, quite the contrary. It's actually an acoustic guitar, maybe even a classical guitar, I'm not entirely sure, and it's a lovely solo that he does, and honestly the only grudge I have with it is the recording quality on it. It's really muffled for some reason. I don't really get why. I don't know if that's an effect they were going for or if that's just something unintended, but honestly, if the sound of this solo would have been crisper like the solos featured on Yes's albums with Steve Howe, like The Clap or Mood for a Day, this would have been totally fantastic and very much fun to listen to, but still, it's pretty nice. And then we get a mid-section, ending section that really sounds like the Echoes mid-section, so very experimental, very ambient in many ways. But then unfortunately this album just fades off into, you know, the void of inexistence. And that's just a bummer, because honestly I wish for them to then back up, come back again, rise up with this grand finale, and then end off this album so you'd remember the ending. But unfortunately the ending for this album is just this odd, obscure, wild mess of sounds that just drifts off into oblivion. But despite all that, this album completely blew me away. I was not expecting this to any extent. This was just a fantastic listen, a near perfect listen if I might even say, and honestly I'd say that this is better than some of their later works, and I don't mean their 80s crap, I mean some of their, you know, good later works. You know, you kind of have the Piper of the Gates of Dawn syndrome on here, where you have a great first album, then you have some things which are lesser than great, and then you have greatness coming later on. But I'm so glad I finally heard this album, and I'm so glad that I was neatly surprised by it, because it was honestly so freaking fun. So I remember not really liking this cover when I saw it firstly last year, but as the time passed my opinion of it changed as well. I do really like the usage of colors on here, having basically two colors of this yellowish sandy tone and a navy blue. And there is something very biblical in this cover. I don't really know how to explain it, but it looks like, you know, old Judea or something like that, just looked from above. And then you have the glowing in the sky, and the Renaissance logo comes out like it's some godly figure. Is this pretentious in any way? Maybe, but honestly you can look at this cover in so many ways and interpret it in so many different ways that this is just my own personal perspective. And while I can't really put my finger on it, I feel that each and every time I look at this cover I gaze into it further and further, and something about it is inherently interesting, and I like that very, very much. And although I wouldn't say that aesthetically this cover is one that blows me away, there is something inherently very interesting and very mesmerizing about it. But all in all, when it comes to the rating of this album, this one gets a very memorable, very notable, very appreciative 9 out of 10. But that's about it guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to Hydromask Groningen by the band Ruins.
I can't believe I just said that right.
Of course, I also want to thank my lovely supporter over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Walnum, you are the best. And if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page on the channel. But that's about it guys, have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.